The thunder cracked like a whip against the night sky as Eleanor Dawson pressed her trembling fingers against the rain-slicked window frame, knowing this moment would either grant her freedom or seal her fate forever. The expensive lace of her wedding gown caught on a jagged splinter of wood, and she yanked it free with such force that the delicate fabric tore. Better the dress than her skin, or worse, her chance at escape. Texas, 1875. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the normally dusty streets of Cottonwood Springs into rivers of mud. The downpour was both Eleanor's curse and her blessing. It made escape more difficult, but also meant fewer people would be out to witness her flight. Behind her, in the lavish bedroom of her fiancé's home, the clock ticked relentlessly toward midnight. In 6 hours, she was meant to walk down the aisle and marry Theodore Wilkes, the wealthiest rancher in the county. A man 30 years her senior with a reputation for cruelty that he took pains to hide beneath fine clothes and practice charm. The engagement had been her father's last desperate act before the consumption took him 3 months ago. Deep in debt and with no prospects, Eleanor had agreed to the arrangement to save what remained of her family's dignity and provide for her younger siblings. But last night, she had discovered the true nature of the man she was to marry. The bruises on Wilkes's housekeeper's face told a story that couldn't be hidden behind stuttered excuses about falling downstairs. When Eleanor had confronted him, his response had chilled her to the bone. "You would do well to mind your own affairs," he had said, eyes cold as winter. "Once we are married, I expect complete obedience. I will not tolerate interference in how I manage my household." She had smiled and nodded, playing the dutiful bride-to-be. Then she had gone to her room and planned her escape. Eleanor forced the window higher, the old wood groaning in protest. The drop to the ground was significant, but not impossible. She had secured what little money she had and some basic provisions in a small satchel strapped to her waist. Her riding clothes were soaked through before she even jumped, but she had no choice now. Her horse, Penny, waited in the grove of trees just beyond the garden, where she had moved her earlier under the pretense of checking a loose shoe. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor swung her legs over the sill and let herself drop, landing awkwardly in the mud. Pain shot through her ankle, but she bit her lip to keep from crying out. It was not broken, merely twisted. She would have to manage. Staying low, she limped through the garden, the rain obscuring her vision and turning her honey blonde hair into dark, wet ropes that clung to her face and neck. The journey to the grove seemed endless, each step an exercise in terror that someone from the house would spot her, but finally she reached the trees. "Penny," she whispered, relief flooding through her as the mare nickered softly in response. The horse was exactly where she had left her, though clearly unhappy about being left in the rain. Eleanor climbed awkwardly into the saddle, her injured ankle protesting, and urged Penny forward. She had no concrete plan beyond escaping Wilkes and Cottonwood Springs, but she had heard of a woman who had built a life for herself in the next county over after being widowed. Perhaps there she might find work as a teacher or seamstress. She rode for what felt like hours, the darkness and rain making it impossible to maintain any sense of direction. She was relying on Penny's instincts to keep to the trail, but the normally sure-footed mare was struggling in the mud and darkness. When a fork in the path appeared, Eleanor hesitated. She had no memory of this junction from her daytime rides. The left path seemed to lead deeper into the forest, while the right curved toward what might be open country. She chose right, hoping for clearer visibility away from the trees. It was a mistake. 10 minutes later, she realized she was riding in circles, having somehow doubled back toward town. Panic began to set in. If she couldn't find her way out of the county by morning, Wilkes would surely send men after her. It was then that she heard the steady rhythm of another horse's hooves, coming toward her through the darkness. Eleanor froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She guided Penny off the trail and into a thicket, praying the newcomer would pass by without noticing them. But Penny, startled by a sudden flash of lightning, whinnied loudly. "Who's there?" a deep voice called out. Eleanor considered making a run for it, but in this weather, with unfamiliar trails, she would likely only injure herself or Penny. Instead, she remained silent, hoping against hope that the rider would move on. No such luck. The sound of hooves came closer, and then a tall figure on horseback emerged from the gloom, reining in his mount just yards from her hiding place. "I know you're there," the voice said, not unkindly. "I'm not looking for trouble, just shelter from this God-forsaken rain." Something in his tone made Eleanor reconsider her silence. I'm a bit lost," she admitted, guiding Penny back to the trail. The rider was a man in his late 20s, with broad shoulders and a face that might be handsome if it weren't currently half obscured by the brim of his hat. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, not the flashy attire of the town dandies or the fine suits of men like Wilkes. "That makes two of us, madam," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "Though I reckon I'm more familiar with these parts than you appear to be. Maxwell Vega at your service." Eleanor hesitated before responding. "Eleanor Dawson." Maxwell studied her for a long moment, taking in her bedraggled appearance and the fine quality of her riding clothes, despite their current state. "You're a fair piece from town, Miss Dawson, especially for such a night." "I have my reasons," she replied stiffly. A knowing look crossed his face. "Running from something or someone, I'd wager," Eleanor stiffened. "That's none of your concern, Mr. Vega." "Perhaps not," he conceded. "But I do know these trails better than most, and at the rate you're going, you'll end up right back where you started." He paused. "Or worse, at the bottom of a ravine." Eleanor bit her lip, considering this stranger could be dangerous, but her alternatives were limited: either trust him for guidance or risk capture or injury on her own. "I need to get to Oak Ridge County," she said finally. "I have connections there." Maxwell nodded. "Oak Ridge is a good 3 days' ride in fair weather. In this," he gestured to the pouring rain, "could be longer, and you'll never make it alone, not with the rivers rising as they are." "I don't have a choice," Eleanor insisted. "Everyone has choices," Maxwell replied evenly. "Some are just more difficult than others." He seemed to make a decision. "My cabin's about an hour's ride from here. It's not much, but it's dry, and you and your horse could use the rest. We can head for Oak Ridge at first light." Eleanor stared at him, suspicious. "Why would you help me?" "You don't know me." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Let's just say I've been where you are, Miss Dawson, running from something that can't be faced head-on. Sometimes the kindness of strangers is all that stands between us and disaster." There was something genuine in his expression that made Eleanor want to trust him, and realistically, she knew she couldn't continue alone in this weather. "One night," she agreed reluctantly, "and then I'll be on my way with or without your guidance." "Fair enough," Maxwell nodded. "Follow me and stay close. The trail gets tricky here." He turned his horse and set off at a careful pace, checking frequently to ensure Eleanor was keeping up. The rain continued to pound down, but somehow having company made it less daunting. Penny seemed to sense it too, following Maxwell's horse with more confidence than she had shown earlier. As they rode side by side through the darkness, Eleanor found herself studying her unexpected companion. He sat his horse with the easy grace of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. His profile was strong, a straight nose, firm jaw dusted with stubble, and eyes that seemed to catch what little light there was in the stormy night. "So, Miss Dawson," he said after they had ridden in silence for some time, "what's in Oak Ridge County that's worth riding through a storm like this?" Eleanor hesitated. "A fresh start," she said finally. Maxwell nodded as if that explained everything. "Running from family troubles or heart troubles?" "Neither," Eleanor replied, then amended, "Well, perhaps a bit of both. I was to be married tomorrow." "And the groom is searching for you now, I imagine." "Not yet, but he will be come morning." Maxwell glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "Must be quite the fellow to have you fleeing in the middle of the night during the worst storm of the season." "Theodore Wilkes," Eleanor said, surprised at how easily the name slipped out. Maxwell's reaction was immediate and unexpected. He pulled his horse to an abrupt halt, causing Eleanor to do the same. Wilkes. Theodore Wilkes of Cottonwood Springs. His voice had lost its easy calm. Eleanor nodded cautiously. You know him. Know of him, Maxwell corrected. Most folks in these parts do. Man's got a reputation that goes beyond county lines. Then you understand why I couldn't go through with the wedding. Maxwell was quiet for a moment, then urged his horse forward again. I understand better than you might think, Miss Dawson. And I'm gladder than ever that your horse and mine crossed paths tonight. They rode on in silence for a while, the rain gradually lessening to a steady drizzle. Finally, Maxwell pointed ahead. There, that's my place. The cabin was small but sturdy, built against the side of a hill for protection from the winds that often swept across the plains. A corral stood empty to one side, and a lean-to shelter offered a dry spot for the horses. Maxwell dismounted and moved to help Eleanor down, but she slid from the saddle before he could reach her. Her ankle, however, betrayed her, buckling as she put weight on it. Maxwell caught her before she could fall. You're hurt, he observed, keeping a steadying hand on her elbow. It's nothing. I twisted it climbing out the window. The admission slipped out before she could stop it. Maxwell raised an eyebrow but didn't comment on her escape method. Let's get you inside. I'll see to the horses. The interior of the cabin was simple but neat. A fireplace dominated one wall with a small kitchen area opposite. A curtain partially concealed what Eleanor assumed was a sleeping area. Maxwell quickly built a fire and the room began to warm. There are some dry clothes behind that curtain, he said, heading back to the door. They'll be too big, but they're clean. I'll give you privacy to change while I tend to the horses. Once alone, Eleanor found the clothes he'd mentioned, a shirt and trousers that indeed swam on her smaller frame but were blessedly dry. She rolled the sleeves and pant legs, then used one of her hairpins to secure the waistband. When Maxwell returned, he had his own change of dry clothes in hand. Better, he asked, noting her improved appearance. Much thank you, Eleanor replied, suddenly awkward in the small space with this man she had just met. I'll step outside while you change. No need, Maxwell assured her. I'll use the storage space out back. Meanwhile, there should be coffee in the tin by the stove, if you'd like to get some started. By the time he returned, Eleanor had coffee brewing and had found potatoes and salt pork, which she was turning into a simple meal. Maxwell paused in the doorway, watching her work with a curious expression. You didn't have to do that, Eleanor shrugged. I wanted to repay your kindness somehow. It's not kindness to offer shelter to someone in need, Miss Dawson. It's basic human decency. Eleanor, she corrected him. If we're to be traveling companions, even temporarily, you might as well use my given name. Eleanor, he repeated, the sound of her name in his deep voice causing an unexpected flutter in her stomach. Then you must call me Maxwell, or Max, as most folks do. They ate in companionable silence, the storm continuing to rage outside. When they had finished, Maxwell insisted on taking the floor, giving Eleanor the small bed behind the curtain. Sleep came surprisingly easily to Eleanor, the exhaustion of her escape and the comfort of relative safety pulling her quickly into slumber. But her dreams were troubled Wilkes finding her, dragging her back to a life of submission and fear. She woke with a start to find early morning light filtering through the cabin's single window. The rain had stopped, though clouds still hung heavy in the sky. Maxwell was already up, preparing a simple breakfast of biscuits and more coffee. The rivers are high, he said without preamble. We'll need to take a different route to Oak Ridge than I'd planned. It'll add a day to the journey. Eleanor nodded, accepting this news with resignation. Wilkes will have men searching by now. All the more reason to get moving, Maxwell agreed. But first, let me look at that ankle. Before she could protest, he knelt and gently examined her injured ankle. His touch was surprisingly tender for hands so work-roughened. It's swollen, but not too badly. I'll wrap it for support before we go. As he worked, Eleanor found herself studying him in the light of day. His hair was dark brown, almost black, and his eyes were a striking blue that contrasted sharply with his sun-darkened skin. A small scar bisected one eyebrow, giving him a perpetually quizzical look. "How did you come to be out in that storm last night?" she asked suddenly. Maxwell's hands stilled momentarily before continuing their task. "I was returning from a neighboring ranch. I help train horses for some of the larger outfits in these parts." "You're a horse trainer, among other things," he replied with a small smile. "I've worked cattle, broken wild mustangs, even tried my hand at silver mining for a spell, but horses are what I understand best." "Is that why Penny took to you so quickly?" Maxwell finished wrapping her ankle and stood. "Penny seems like a smart horse." "She knows who means her harm and who doesn't." He met Eleanor's gaze directly. "Same as her owner, I hope." The journey that day was slow but steady. Maxwell led them along game trails and forgotten paths, clearly intent on avoiding main roads where Wilkes's men might be searching. He was a quiet companion but not unfriendly, pointing out landmarks and sharing occasional stories about the area. By midday, they had crossed into territory unfamiliar to Eleanor. The landscape changed subtly, the rolling hills giving way to more rugged terrain. They stopped to rest the horses by a small stream, taking advantage of the break in the rain to eat some of the provisions Maxwell had packed. "How did you learn these trails?" Eleanor asked, watching as he refilled their canteens. "Necessity," Maxwell replied. "When I first came to this territory, I was young and found myself on the wrong side of some powerful men. Knowing the back ways meant survival." "Is that what you meant when you said you'd been where I am?" Maxwell nodded slowly. "Something like that. Though my troubles were more of my own making than yours seem to be." "What happened?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious about this man who had come to her aid so readily. Maxwell was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. "I fell in love with the wrong woman," he said finally. "Or rather, a woman who belonged to the wrong man." Eleanor felt a pang of sympathy. "And you had to leave?" "I did," he confirmed, "but not before things got complicated." He stood abruptly. "We should keep moving. There's a place about 4 hours' ride from here where we can spend the night." They rode in silence for a time, Eleanor mulling over this new information. She had initially seen Maxwell as simply a good Samaritan, but now she recognized a kindred spirit, someone else who understood what it meant to flee from a situation that threatened to consume you. Late afternoon brought another bout of rain, forcing them to seek shelter under a rocky overhang. They sat side by side watching the downpour, their horses ground tied nearby. "Will you tell me about him?" Maxwell asked suddenly. "Wilkes, I mean." "What led you to agree to marry him in the first place?" Eleanor sighed. "My father died in debt. Wilkes offered to clear those debts and provide for my younger siblings in exchange for my hand." She twisted the reins in her hands. It seemed a fair bargain at the time. "I knew he wasn't marrying me for love, but I thought I could at least expect decent treatment." "What changed?" "I saw what he did to his housekeeper, the bruises, the fear in her eyes." Eleanor's voice caught. "And when I confronted him, he made it clear that once we were married, I could expect the same if I didn't obey him without question." Maxwell's jaw tightened. Men like Wilkes don't change, they just get better at hiding their true nature until they have what they want. "You sound like you speak from experience." "I've known my share of men like him," Maxwell acknowledged, "the kind who see others as possessions rather than people." He glanced at her. "What will you do in Oak Ridge? There's a widow there who runs a small school." "I wrote to her when my father first became ill, inquiring about teaching positions. She responded that she could use the help, but by then, the engagement to Wilkes was already arranged." Eleanor shrugged. "I'm hoping the offer still stands. You're a teacher." "I was training to be one before my father's illness called me home. I never completed my studies, but I've always loved learning." Maxwell smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "I can see that about you. You have a curious mind." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected compliment. "And what about you? Will you stay in these parts, training horses for the neighboring ranches? A shadow passed over Maxwell's face. I've been thinking it might be time to move on. I've been here 3 years, and that's longer than I usually stay in one place. Because of the woman you mentioned, are you still in danger from her? Husband? No, Maxwell shook his head. That was many years ago in another territory altogether. But the habit of moving on has stuck with me, I suppose. Eleanor studied him thoughtfully. That sounds like a lonely life. It has its moments, he admitted, but there's freedom in it too. The rain began to taper off, and Maxwell stood, offering Eleanor a hand up. We should make use of this break in the weather. The place I mentioned isn't far now. As they continued their journey, Eleanor found herself increasingly comfortable in Maxwell's company. He was a man of few words, but those he spoke were thoughtful. And despite his initial reticence about his past, he gradually shared more stories of his travels across the Western Territories. The place he had mentioned turned out to be another cabin, smaller and less well-maintained than his own, but still offering shelter from the elements. An old trapper's cabin, Maxwell explained as they approached. He died 2 winters ago. No one's claimed it since. They settled in for the night, Maxwell again taking the floor despite Eleanor's protests. As she lay in the small bed, listening to the gentle sound of his breathing, Eleanor realized with a start that she felt safer with this near stranger than she had in months. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a welcome change from the previous day's rain. They set out early, Maxwell estimating they would reach Oak Ridge County by nightfall if the good weather held. As they rode, Eleanor found herself dreading the journey's end. Once they reached Oak Ridge, she would have to say goodbye to Maxwell and face an uncertain future alone. The realization that she would miss his steady presence beside her came as a surprise. Tell me more about this school in Oak Ridge, Maxwell said, breaking a comfortable silence. What subjects will you teach? Eleanor smiled, grateful for the distraction from her melancholy thoughts. Reading, writing, arithmetic, the usual, but I've always had a special fondness for history and literature. Literature, Maxwell raised an eyebrow. Any favorites? Shakespeare, of course, and I've recently discovered Mr. Dickens's works. A Tale of Two Cities, Maxwell said unexpectedly. That's a fine one. Eleanor looked at him in surprise. You've read Dickens. A hint of embarrassment crossed Maxwell's face. Don't look so shocked. Cowboys can read too, you know. I didn't mean I know you didn't, he cut her off gently. The truth is, books have been my companions on many a lonely trail. My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father. She made sure I appreciated the value of education, even if my life took a different path. This new piece of information made Eleanor see Maxwell in a different light. Where are your parents now? Gone, he said simply. Pa died in a mining accident when I was 14. Ma followed a few years later, influenza. I'm sorry, Eleanor said softly. It was a long time ago. Maxwell's tone made it clear he didn't wish to dwell on the subject. What about your mother? You mentioned your father, but not her. She died bringing my youngest sister into the world, Eleanor replied. I was 12, old enough to take on many of her duties in raising the little ones. And your siblings now, you said Wilkes promised to provide for them. My brother Jacob is 16. He's apprenticed to the blacksmith in town. My sisters, Ruth and Sarah, are 13 and 7. They're staying with our aunt for now. Eleanor's voice caught. I hate that I had to leave them behind, but I couldn't take them with me, not when I have no idea what awaits me in Oak Ridge. Maxwell was quiet for a moment. Once you're settled, you could send for them. Perhaps, Eleanor agreed, though the practical challenges of such an arrangement seemed insurmountable. They stopped to rest the horses around midday, finding a grassy clearing beside a small creek. As they ate a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, Eleanor noticed Maxwell scanning their surroundings with increased vigilance. Is something wrong? She asked. Maxwell hesitated before answering. I'm not certain, but I think we're being followed. Fear, which had receded during their journey, came rushing back. Wilkes's men? Possibly. I've noticed tracks paralleling ours since this morning. Whoever it is, they're being cautious, staying just out of sight." Eleanor's hand instinctively went to the small knife Maxwell had given her the previous day for protection. "What do? We keep moving, but more carefully. There's a ridge ahead where the trail narrows. If someone is indeed following us, they'll have to show themselves there or fall behind." They mounted up and continued their journey, the peaceful mood of the morning now replaced with tense vigilance. Eleanor found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. When they reached the ridge Maxwell had mentioned, he motioned for her to continue ahead while he hung back slightly, one hand resting on the revolver at his hip. Eleanor had gone perhaps 50 yards when she heard the sound of hooves behind her, followed by Maxwell's sharp command. "That's far enough." She turned to see Maxwell facing two riders who had emerged from the trees. Even at a distance, she recognized one of them, Frank Morris, Wilkes's foreman. "Miss Dawson," Morris called out, ignoring Maxwell. "Mr. Wilkes is mighty concerned about you. He's offered a reward for your safe return." "She's not going back," Maxwell stated flatly. "Turn around and ride out of here," Morris sneered. "This ain't your concern, cowboy." "The lady's engaged to Mr. Wilkes. We're just here to escort her home." "I broke that engagement," Eleanor said firmly, guiding Penny back to Maxwell's side, "and I have no intention of returning." The second rider, a burly man Eleanor didn't recognize, spat on the ground. "Ain't asking your permission, lady. Wilkes pays good money and we aim to collect." Maxwell's voice remained steady, but Eleanor could sense the tension coiled within him. 2 against 2 aren't great odds, gentlemen, especially when one of those two has nothing to lose. Morris hesitated, clearly reassessing the situation. "You willing to die for a woman you barely know, cowboy, if necessary?" Maxwell replied without hesitation. "Question is, are you willing to die for Wilkes's money?" A long, tense silence followed. Finally, Morris jerked his head at his companion. "This ain't over. Wilkes has men all over these counties. You won't make it to Oak Ridge." "We already have," Maxwell replied calmly. "You're standing in Oak Ridge County now," Morris cursed but turned his horse. "Come on, Bill. We'll report back to Wilkes." Before leaving, he fixed Eleanor with a hard stare. "He won't forget this, Miss Dawson, and neither will your family." The threat hung in the air as the two men rode off. Eleanor felt sick with worry. "My siblings will be fine," Maxwell assured her. "Wilkes won't risk his reputation by harming children even to get to you. That would turn the whole county against him." Eleanor wasn't entirely convinced, but there was little she could do at present. "How far are we from town?" "About 3 hours' ride," Maxwell answered. "But I think we should avoid the main road, in case Morris was telling the truth about Wilkes having more men in the area." They took an even more circuitous route than planned, Maxwell frequently doubling back or taking seemingly random turns to throw off any potential pursuers. The sun was setting by the time they finally crested a hill and saw the lights of Oak Ridge in the distance. "There it is," Maxwell said softly. "Your fresh start." Eleanor felt a surge of conflicting emotions, relief at reaching her destination safely, anxiety about the uncertainties ahead, and an unexpected sadness at the thought of saying goodbye to Maxwell. "I can't thank you enough," she said, turning to him. "I would never have made it here without your help." Maxwell shook his head. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Eleanor. You would have found a way." They rode into town as night fell, the streets mostly empty save for the usual evening activity around the saloon. Maxwell led them to a small boarding house at the quieter end of the main street. "Mrs. Henderson runs this place," he explained. "She's a good woman, discreet. You'll be safe here while you contact the school widow." Eleanor dismounted, wincing slightly as her injured ankle took her weight. "You know Mrs. Henderson?" "I've passed through Oak Ridge a few times," Maxwell said vaguely. "Come on, let's get you settled." Mrs. Henderson turned out to be a plump, motherly woman who took one look at Eleanor's travel-worn appearance and immediately bustled about preparing a hot bath and meal. She asked no questions about their late arrival or the circumstances that brought them to her door. After Eleanor had bathed and changed into clean clothes borrowed from Mrs. Henderson, she joined Maxwell in the small dining room. He had also cleaned up, his dark hair still damp from washing, and had evidently charmed Mrs. Henderson into providing a hot meal despite the late hour. "I've sent word to Mrs. Bailey, that's the widow who runs the school," Maxwell informed her as they ate. "She'll come by in the morning." Eleanor set down her fork in surprise. "How did you know her name? I never mentioned it." Maxwell looked momentarily caught off guard. "You must have, during our journey." "No," Eleanor insisted, certain. "I didn't. I only said she was a widow who ran a school." A long silence stretched between them, Maxwell clearly debating how to respond. Finally, he sighed. "The truth is, I know Mrs. Bailey. She was a friend of my mother's long ago." Eleanor stared at him. "That's quite a coincidence." "Not entirely," Maxwell admitted. "When you mentioned a widow with a school in Oakridge, I suspected it might be her. There aren't many who fit that description. So you knew all along where we were headed, to someone you already knew." "I didn't know for certain until you described your correspondence with her." Maxwell met her gaze directly. "I should have said something sooner, but I wasn't sure how much to trust you at first." Eleanor considered this, finding she couldn't fault his caution given the circumstances of their meeting. "Will she really see me tomorrow?" "She will," Maxwell confirmed. "And I think you'll find her receptive to your situation. Sarah Bailey knows what it's like to forge her own path in a world that doesn't make that easy for women." They finished their meal in thoughtful silence. As they prepared to retire for the night, Eleanor to a small but comfortable room upstairs, Maxwell to more modest accommodations at the back of the house, an awkwardness fell between them that hadn't been present during their journey. "Will you be leaving in the morning?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Maxwell hesitated. "I thought I might stay a day or two, make sure Wilkes's men don't cause any trouble." Relief flooded through Eleanor, though she tried not to show it. "That's very considerate of you." "Not consideration," Maxwell corrected her gently. "Concern." His blue eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary before he bid her good night. Eleanor slept fitfully, despite the comfortable bed. Her dreams were a confusing tangle of past and present Wilkes pursuing her through endless rain, her siblings calling for help she couldn't provide, and Maxwell, always just out of reach. She woke early, the strange room momentarily disorienting her before the events of the past few days came rushing back. Dressing quickly in the same borrowed clothes from the night before, she made her way downstairs to find Maxwell already at the table, deep in conversation with an elegant older woman. "Ah, here she is now," Maxwell said, rising as Eleanor entered. "Eleanor Dawson, may I present Mrs. Sarah Bailey?" Mrs. Bailey was not what Eleanor had expected. Rather than the matronly figure she had imagined, the widow was a slender woman in her early 50s with intelligent eyes and a direct manner. "Miss Dawson," she greeted Eleanor warmly. "Maxwell has told me something of your situation. I must say it takes considerable courage to leave the security of a wealthy marriage for an uncertain future." "It wasn't security, madam," Eleanor replied honestly. "It was a prison." Mrs. Bailey nodded approvingly. "Well said, please join us. We have much to discuss about your potential position at my school." The next hour passed in a detailed conversation about the school, the students, and what would be expected of Eleanor as an assistant teacher. Mrs. Bailey was frank about the modest salary and challenging conditions, but also passionate about the importance of education, particularly for girls. "Most of my students are from farming or ranching families," she explained. "They have limited time for schooling between chores and helping their parents, but they're eager to learn, and that makes all the difference." By the end of their discussion, it was settled. Eleanor would begin at the school the following week, with living quarters provided in a small room attached to the schoolhouse. "This is more than I dared hope for," Eleanor admitted as Mrs. Bailey prepared to leave. "I can't thank you enough." "Thank Maxwell," Mrs. Bailey said with a small smile. He spoke quite highly of your intelligence and determination, and I've known him long enough to value his judgment. She patted Eleanor's hand. Rest today. Come to the school tomorrow and I'll show you around. After Mrs. Bailey departed, Eleanor turned to Maxwell, questions bubbling up. How do you know Mrs. Bailey? You said she was a friend of your mother's, but there seems to be more to it. Maxwell leaned back in his chair, studying Eleanor for a moment before answering. After my mother died, I was lost. Made some poor choices, fell in with the wrong crowd. Mrs. Bailey was teaching in a different town then. She remembered me from when I was a boy and offered me a place to stay, helped to get back on my feet. He smiled slightly. I owe her a great deal. She clearly thinks highly of you, Eleanor observed. She's kind, Maxwell replied dismissively, and forgiving of past mistakes. Eleanor sensed there was more to the story than he was sharing, but decided not to press. After all, she too had parts of her life she wasn't ready to discuss openly. The day passed quietly. Eleanor purchased a few necessities with the small amount of money she had brought, while Maxwell checked on the horses and inquired discreetly about any strangers in town who might be working for Wilkes. That evening, they walked together through the small town, Maxwell pointing out various establishments and introducing Eleanor to a few townspeople he knew. It felt strangely domestic, as if they were an established couple rather than two people thrown together by circumstance. Will you really leave soon? Eleanor asked as they stood watching the sunset from a small bridge over the creek that ran through town. Maxwell was silent for a long moment. I don't know, he admitted finally. I've been thinking about what you said about moving on being a lonely life. Hope fluttered in Eleanor's chest. And I'm wondering if maybe it's time to stop running. He turned to face her, his expression more open than she had yet seen it. Eleanor, I know we've only known each other a few days, but he was interrupted by a shout from the direction of the main street. They both turned to see a man running toward them, waving urgently. Maxwell. Riders coming in from the east, 6 of them, asking after a blonde woman and a dark-haired cowboy. Maxwell's face hardened. Wilkes's men, we need to get you somewhere safe. They hurried back toward the boarding house, but halfway there, Maxwell pulled Eleanor into the shadow of a building as a group of riders clattered down the street. Too late, he muttered. They're between us and Mrs. Henderson's. What do we do? Eleanor whispered, fear clutching at her throat. Maxwell thought quickly. The school, Mrs. Bailey keeps a shotgun and the building has a cellar. They took a roundabout route, staying to back alleys and gardens, finally reaching the small schoolhouse on the edge of town. Maxwell rapped softly on Mrs. Bailey's door and the widow appeared almost immediately, taking in the situation at a glance. Inside, quickly, she urged, ushering them through to a cozy living area. I heard about the riders. Half the town is talking about them. They work for Theodore Wilkes, Eleanor explained hastily. He's the man I was supposed to marry. Mrs. Bailey's lips thinned. I see. She moved to a cabinet and removed a shotgun. Let them come. This is my property and you are under my protection. No, Maxwell shook his head. This isn't your fight, Sarah, and I won't bring violence to your school. What do you propose instead? Mrs. Bailey asked skeptically. Maxwell looked at Eleanor. I think it's time to stop running and face this directly. Eleanor's eyes widened. You want to confront them? Not all of them, Maxwell clarified. Wilkes, he's the source of this. If we can make him back down, his men will follow suit. And how exactly do you plan to make a man like Theodore Wilkes back down? Mrs. Bailey demanded. By giving him something he wants more than Eleanor, Maxwell replied grimly. Information that could ruin him. Both women stared at him in confusion. Maxwell sighed. There's something I haven't told you, Eleanor, the real reason I recognized Wilkes's name when you first mentioned him. What is it? Eleanor asked, sensing this was important. 3 years ago, before I settled in these parts, I worked briefly for a cattle broker in Kansas. We discovered that one of our clients was running a sophisticated rustling operation stealing cattle across 3 territories and selling them with falsified papers. Maxwell's eyes were hard. That client was Theodore Wilkes, Eleanor gasped. You have proof of this? I have documentation, bills of sale, correspondence, witness statements. I kept it all, thinking it might be useful someday. I never imagined how useful. Where is this evidence now? Mrs. Bailey asked practically. Hidden, not far from here actually. I moved it to a secure location when I first arrived in this territory. Eleanor shook her head, trying to absorb this new information. So you propose to blackmail Wilkes into leaving me alone? Not blackmail, Maxwell corrected. Negotiation. He leaves you and your family in peace, or I take what I know to the territorial authorities. Mrs. Bailey looked skeptical. Men like Wilkes don't negotiate, they eliminate problems. Not when the problem has insurance, Maxwell replied with a grim smile. I've ensured the evidence will find its way to the right people if anything happens to me. Eleanor studied his face, seeing the determination there. I can't let you risk yourself this way, Maxwell, not for me. It's not just for you, he said quietly. It's for every person Wilkes has hurt or would hurt in the future. Men like him only stop when they're forced to. A tense silence filled the room. Finally, Mrs. Bailey spoke. I think Miss Dawson should have a say in this decision. It's her future at stake. All eyes turned to Eleanor. She took a deep breath, considering. Part of her wanted to keep running to avoid confrontation. But another part, the part that had found the courage to climb out that window in the rain, knew that running would never truly free her. I'll face him with you, she said finally. Not hiding behind your protection, but standing beside you. Maxwell started to protest, but Eleanor held up a hand. I made the choice to leave. I need to make the choice to stand my ground too. Mrs. Bailey nodded approvingly. Well said. Now, let's prepare for this confrontation properly. I may be a schoolteacher, but I've lived in frontier towns long enough to know how these matters are best handled. The plan they formulated was simple but effective. Rather than waiting for Wilkes's men to find them, they would send word to the hotel where the men had taken rooms, requesting a meeting in the town's small courthouse the following morning. Public, but formal, Mrs. Bailey explained. It puts everything on a legal footing from the start and makes violence less likely. That night, Eleanor barely slept, going over and over what she would say to Wilkes when she saw him. Maxwell had retrieved his documentation from its hiding place, and the evidence against Wilkes was indeed substantial. But Eleanor knew that legal consequences might not be enough to deter a man accustomed to buying his way out of trouble. Morning came too quickly. Eleanor dressed carefully in clothes Mrs. Bailey had loaned her, a simple but dignified blue dress that made her look more mature and composed than she felt. Remember, Maxwell said as they walked toward the courthouse, you've done nothing wrong. You broke no laws by refusing to marry him. I know, Eleanor replied, though her stomach was tied in knots. I just hope this works. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived. Word had spread through the small town about the confrontation, and many locals had gathered to witness the drama. Wilkes himself sat at one of the tables, his expression thunderous. Beside him were Frank Morris and several other men Eleanor recognized from Cottonwood Springs. As they walked down the center aisle, Wilkes rose. Eleanor, he said, his voice carrying in the quiet room. This foolishness has gone on long enough. It's time to come home. Eleanor stopped a few paces from him, Maxwell at her side. I am home, Mr. Wilkes. Oak Ridge is my home now. Wilkes's face darkened. You are my fiancé. We have a contract. A contract made under false pretenses, Eleanor countered. You presented yourself as an honorable man. You are not. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Wilkes glanced around, clearly unhappy with the public nature of this confrontation. This is a private matter, he snapped. Not anymore. Maxwell stepped forward, placing a stack of papers on the table. These documents detail your involvement in cattle rustling operations across 3 territories, theft on a scale that would put you in prison for many years. Wilkes went pale, then red with fury. You're bluffing. And even if you weren't, who would believe a drifter over a respected businessman? The territorial marshal might. Mrs. Bailey spoke up from where she had been sitting quietly. especially given that the documentation includes correspondence in your own handwriting. For the first time, Wilkes seemed to falter. He glanced at the papers, then at Eleanor, calculation evident in his eyes. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "It's simple," Eleanor said, finding strength in the moment. "You will release me from any engagement. You will leave my family in peace. You will never again attempt to contact me or influence my life in any way. And in return," Wilkes's voice was tight with suppressed rage, "in return, these documents remain private," Maxwell said evenly. "Your reputation in Cottonwood Springs remains intact." Wilkes stared at them for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Fine, consider the engagement dissolved. I want it in writing," Eleanor insisted, surprising herself with her boldness. "Here before witnesses." The town's justice of the peace, who had been watching the proceedings with great interest, stepped forward. "I can draft such a document if all parties agree." An hour later, it was done. Wilkes signed a formal dissolution of the engagement and a statement that Eleanor Dawson was free of all obligations to him. In return, Maxwell sealed the incriminating documents in an envelope to be held by the justice, released only if Wilkes broke his word. As Wilkes and his men prepared to depart, he paused beside Eleanor. "You think you've won," he said softly for her ears alone. "But you've given up a life of comfort for, what, teaching grubby farm children for pennies?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I've given up a cage for freedom, Mr. Wilkes. I consider that a fair trade." He had no response to that, merely turning on his heel and striding from the courthouse. The assembled townspeople broke into spontaneous applause as the door closed behind him. In the days that followed, Eleanor settled into her new life with surprising ease. The school children took to her immediately, and she found genuine satisfaction in helping them learn. Mrs. Bailey proved to be not just an employer but a mentor and friend, and Maxwell stayed. "I thought you always moved on," Eleanor teased him one evening as they walked together after supper, a routine they had established. "I'm reconsidering that policy," he replied with a small smile. "Turns out there are some things worth staying for." The summer passed in a blur of teaching, learning the rhythms of the small town, and spending every free moment with Maxwell. He found work training horses for local ranchers, his reputation as a skilled horseman quickly spreading. In August, Eleanor received a letter from her brother Jacob, now living with their sisters in a neighboring town where he had found work in a larger smithy. Their aunt had encouraged the move after Wilkes's return from Oak Ridge, sensing that distance might be safer for the children. "They're well," Eleanor told Maxwell as they sat on the porch of the small cabin he had built on the edge of town. "Jacob says Ruth is helping in a dressmaker's shop and Sarah has started school." "You miss them," Maxwell observed. "Every day," Eleanor admitted. "But Jacob writes that they might visit at Christmas if they save enough for the journey." Maxwell was quiet for a moment. "Or we could bring them here permanently." Eleanor stared at him. "What?" "I've been offered a position managing the Henderson Ranch," Maxwell explained. "It would mean a steady income, a larger home, room for your siblings if they wanted to come." "But why would you?" Eleanor began, then fell silent as understanding dawned. Maxwell took her hand, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "Because I love you, Eleanor. I think I started falling in love with you that first night when you were so determined to forge your own path despite the risks. Every day since has only deepened that feeling." Eleanor's heart soared. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been afraid to say it, afraid you'd see it as an obligation to stay when you've always valued your freedom." "The freest I've ever felt is when I'm with you," Maxwell said simply. "Will you marry me, Eleanor?" "Not out of necessity or obligation, but because we choose each other freely and completely?" "Yes," Eleanor answered without hesitation. 1,000 times yes. They were married in October when the leaves were turning gold and red on the hills surrounding Oak Ridge. Mrs. Bailey hosted the ceremony at the schoolhouse, and to Eleanor's overwhelming joy, her siblings arrived the day before. Jacob having saved enough for their passage. As Eleanor stood beside Maxwell, speaking vows that came from her heart rather than duty, she thought back to that stormy night when she had climbed through a window, desperate and afraid. The journey from that moment to this one had been neither easy nor direct, but it had led her exactly where she needed to be. Later, as they danced under lantern light in the schoolyard, Maxwell pulled her close. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly. "Leaving what could have been a life of material comfort?" Eleanor shook her head, thinking of the small but loving home they had created, the work that fulfilled her, the man who treasured her mind as much as her heart. "Not for a single moment," she replied. "Some escapes are actually beginnings in disguise." Maxwell smiled, the expression lighting his blue eyes. "Then I'm glad your horse met mine in the dark that night." "So am I," Eleanor whispered, standing on tiptoe to kiss him as the music played on and their future stretched before them, as wide and promising as the western sky.